That tells me a lot that I don't know. Welcome to Walking with Jesus. We are in lesson 24, and Jesus is rejected. Can you imagine that? And so he's going to talk to us tonight about how to deal with the rejection, or another little subtitle there, Stay the Course Against the Crowd. And we're discussing some of that already this evening. Here is our timeline. Now we're right down here. Jesus is now in Galilee. So we're down here in the last part of the first year of ministry. And at this moment he's only got about 5 of the men who he will later choose as apostles. He hasn't gotten all 12 of his apostles together yet. So actually the 12 apostles only got about 2 years of training before Jesus went to the cross. So they got their associate degree and then they were on their own. And the associate degree looked like a doctorate degree when Jesus was teaching them. Well, do you recall a time when you were a child and the other children played keep away from you? Maybe they grabbed your hat and you're trying to get your hat back, and they have fun throwing your hat to somebody else, and just about the time you get there they throw it to somebody else. How'd that make you feel? Did your peers ever call you names? Have you ever felt rejected by others who you wanted to identify with? You know, no one likes to be rejected. Back during my high school years were not the best years of my life because I had, I'm going to say, low self-esteem. And every once in a while I would do something and my classmates would pick on me. And I got teased and called names and shoved around, and it wasn't because I was a Christian, really. It was just because I did something stupid. And it hurt. It hurt a lot. Of course, there was a couple of students that I picked on too, so I'm not as holy as I want to make you think I am. But it didn't feel good. And you know, if you were ever teased or called names, we don't like being called names or played keep away from, like we've got some sort of a contagious, oh, don't touch me or I might get what you got. We all want to feel that we fit in. We want to be respected by those around us and have something significant to offer the community. And so it's really a good feeling when you find out this is what I'm good at. Oh, if we can help more young people to find out what they're good at early on in life, then that helps them deal with the times when their peers are being hard on them and giving them a hard time. We're going to be in Luke chapter 4, verses 16 to 30 tonight. Jesus is human as well as God, and he's subject to the same emotions and struggles that you and I face. One of the things that I enjoy and I try to emphasize as we go through the Walking with Jesus Bible Study series is there's nothing that you've gone through in your life that Jesus hasn't experienced. He knows what it is to go through those trials, and yet he did it without sin, and so that just puts a lot more I got to work hard at turning down those temptations so I don't sin. So how does Jesus deal with rejection? Well, first of all, life involves taking risks. We're in Luke chapter 4, verses 16 to 19. Now Jesus went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom, and he stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." So Jesus returns to visit the hometown where he grew up. Now Nazareth is about 15 miles west-southwest of Tiberias. So that would just put us almost Plant City from where we're sitting here. He seeks to tell them about the Messiah, but they are just not open to believing in him. Now this is kind of interesting because as we've talked in previous lessons, there was this general anticipation among the Jewish people because they understood some of Daniel's prophecies and some of the other prophecies that the feet of clay, feet of iron and so forth, that the Messiah was near. It was time for the Messiah to appear. But here Jesus comes and says, "Here I am," and they don't accept that. So they develop an attitude towards him. They want to think of him only as the carpenter's son, not as a spiritual leader and not as a Messiah. We saw him grow up. We saw him do well in school. Yeah, he was a sharp student. He was always, never got in trouble, except for when he was 12 years old. But he was always an obedient child, respectful of other people, and boy, some things our young people need to be taught today. So they would why would they have trouble recognizing him as Messiah? What would the people from your hometown say about you today if you were to go back to your hometown? Have you ever gone somewhere and felt rejected by those who were there? Why did you feel rejected? I never went back to my high school for any of my high school reunions, for the reasons I said just a minute ago. They just weren't the best years of my life. Now, I've since connected with some of my classmates on Facebook and found that some of them are very strong Christians, and the way we relate to each other a lot more mature than we did back 45, almost 50 years ago. A couple more years, it'll be my 50th high school reunion. We'll see what happens between now and then. But it just wasn't the best time of my life. So, would you be willing to be rejected and stand for God even at the risk of your life in an ungodly environment? How about where you work? I was working in Neutrogena. I had some a couple of Christian things around my cubicle where I was working, and my manager told me a couple of times to take them down. I didn't do it. The company was owned by a Jewish guy, and I was down in his office working on his Macintosh computer. Got to talk to him. He's just a regular guy, just like you and me. He just happened to be the guy that owned the company. And most of the people are, if we would allow them to be that. But other issues caused my departure from Neutrogena. Beautiful products, still like there, but I don't work there anymore, obviously. Anyhow, I was willing to stand for, I didn't want to be obnoxious, didn't want to be too in your face, but I wanted to let people know where I stood. And I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Now, there are people today, we were talking a bit ago about the bakery and the flower shop and a few others that have been targeted for persecution because they won't cater to the world's definition of we want you to serve us. And they say this violates my religious beliefs, so I can't do that. And so the conglomerate gangs up on the individual. That sounds like a fair fight, doesn't it? Fortunately, Christians are coming alongside them, both attorneys and Christian financial support, and they're working on fighting that fight. So if you are in business, if you are doing anything that's going to be standing up for Christ, there is going to be somebody who's going to think that you're a target, and they're going to look for a reason to ridicule you. You're a professor in a college, you're a teacher in a school. How many of our school teachers can't mention the name of Jesus in the classroom because somebody will accuse them? When I was going to school, it was not thought of as an issue. I think it was about the time they got prayer out of school, and I never really thought that much about it. I think, unfortunately, that's what a lot of people did. They didn't think that much about it. Now we're saying foul, and we're fighting to get back what we've lost from those who think they can take it away from us. Well, here's our map, and we're just over here's the Sea of Galilee and Tiberias, and you just come down west, southwest, right down here to Nazareth. Jesus has been up to Cana. Now he happens to be back down in Nazareth. He's going to be over here in Capernaum a little bit later on. That gives you a little perspective of how one is in relation to the other. Well, Jesus says, use your gifts to glorify God. Luke chapter 4, verse 20 and 21. Then he rolled up the scroll and he gave it back to the attendant and he sat down. Now the eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened upon him. And he began to say to them, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. That's a pretty powerful statement. What he just read and said, okay, basically he's saying, I'm the one. I'm the one that's going to teach you. I'm the one that's going to heal you. I'm the one that's going to do all these things that we're told about in this prophecy. You see, like any proper Jew, Jesus attends the worship service at a synagogue every Sabbath. Some of us Christians have still got something to work on there. In fact, he started to gather a following and accompanying attention that goes. Jesus has already done some public speaking. He'd already done some miracles down both in Judea and Jerusalem and now up in Galilee. And so he's starting to get a bit of a crowd. And Jesus appears, hey, we want to see if he's going to do some more of those magic tricks, healing people and giving sight to the blind and stuff like that. And so he's got a crowd with him, an entourage, if you will. So he started to gather a following. He often reads Scripture in many of the Sabbath services. We don't know that he did in every Sabbath service, but it's not uncommon to him. So the question is, when you're traveling, do you make it a point to worship at a local church on the Lord's Day? Back when I was a kid growing up in Kansas, my aunts and uncles all lived in Illinois, my grandparents. So when Dad got 2 weeks vacation from the railroad, we'd all climb in the car, and it'd take a whole day to drive from Kansas across Missouri. That was before the interstate system. And we were traveling when they were building the interstate system, and when we got on the interstate system, that section was fast. The rest of it was kind of like we had to slow down for every town we drove through. Remember those days? Some of you might remember those days. And it would take a good 12 hours to drive from Council Grove, Kansas to Greenville, Illinois. And we'd stay in the week, 2 weeks, with both our grandparents and our aunts and uncles and our cousins. Get my Uncle Denver to cut my hair. He was a barber up there south of Decatur, Illinois. That was a special treat. Uncle Leland, that for early years, owned a general store right across from Grandma Harrison, and we'd go over there, and if we were really good, we might con him into letting us have a bottle of soda pop out of the soda pop machine, and all those sorts of things. Anyhow, but the reason I tell you all that is if we were traveling on a Sunday, Dad would find a Christian church somewhere about the time of church service, and we would stop for service. And we would stay for the song service, and usually communion, and sometimes for the sermon, but sometimes we'd leave after communion, just depending on how far behind schedule they were and so forth. But we would travel, but we always try to be in the Lord's house on Sunday. And Sylvia and I have made this habit too. If we're not in our neighborhood, if we're on a trip over a weekend, a vacation or whatever, we try to find a church somewhere and go and fellowship. And you know what is neat? Everywhere we go, we found people that love Jesus. Isn't that amazing? Now, some of them worship a little different than the way I do, but they still love Jesus. And I think that's kind of powerful. So, hopefully when you travel, you'll make Sunday attendance a worship time to worship God, an important part of your journey. Jesus gets close to the passage that he will read. He rolls to what you and I know as Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 and 2. Now, they didn't have chapter and verse divisions in their Bible, or in the scroll back then. He just had to roll through there. He probably had it fairly well memorized, read through it enough times. Let's see, down a little further, down a little further, down a little, let's see, oh, a little too far, back up a little bit. Oh, there it is, right there. And he found the passage he wanted. He read that passage to them, which basically, after reading Scripture, Jesus explains it in one sentence, that he's the Messiah. The sermons today, some sermons today should probably be that short. Jesus concludes his comments by stating that his prophecy has now been fulfilled. In other words, he's saying he is the Messiah. His authority is the Spirit of God, who has qualified him to proclaim this truth. His mission is to release captives from the sin in their lives. Now, Luke leaves out heal the brokenhearted, that's in the Isaiah passage. He only uses heal for physical ailments. But what God has qualified you to do, what has God qualified you to do for his kingdom? And maybe another question would be, what has God healed you from? And you'll say, my sin. Because that is the biggest thing. Whether he's healed you physically of anything or not, the fact that he's healed you from your sin is tremendous. Where would we be if we weren't healed from our sin? We don't want to go there. Well, Jesus' concern for the spiritually poor, Jesus' concern is for the spiritually poor more so than for the physically poor. He offers a freedom from sin that is far more valuable than any healing and all the other physical maladies or material affluence that we could seek. No matter who we are, rich or poor, old or young, big or small, every one of us has probably got some sort of a physical malady of some sort, little something happening that we would like to have relief from. We would like to be healed. And of course, as we're getting older and it's getting a little more snow on the roof, right, Paul? I've got to pick on him because he's got a lot of snow on the roof. That healing becomes a little more, I've got this and I've got this. We could probably have the whole rest of the night just talking about my aches and my pains and my joints and my whatever else. And, oh, God would just heal me of these things. He's just preparing you for heaven. One of these days, these aches and pains and ailments and healings and all that get just too much to live through, and you'll just go to sleep and wake up with Jesus. Don't rush it, but it's coming. But in all, Jesus offers something far more valuable. In all of Jesus' miracles, he does not make anyone rich. He does compensate Peter for the use of his boat a couple of times, and he compensates him, I would say, pretty well. But the material reward was still limited. See, life is not about wealth. We get so focused up. I'm frustrated because there's so many more people that could be in Walking with Jesus Bible study if I just had the money to tell them about it and get the books printed so that they could start a Walking with Jesus study group at their church. But it's not about the wealth. It's not about money. It's about our relationship with God. And walking with Jesus or no walking with Jesus, you can still work on your relationship with God. Well, when you're dealing with rejection, sometimes you have to confront those who oppose you. Luke chapter 4, verses 21 through 27. All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. "Isn't this Joseph's son?" they asked. And Jesus said to him, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself.' Do here in your hometown what we've seen and heard that you did in Capernaum. I tell you the truth," he continued, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, and yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian." Most of the people of Nazareth remember Jesus growing up as a child. And it's hard to tell if their reaction to him is amazement or resentment. They may be amazed that he's teaching such wow. There may be resentment. You know, we have a tendency to stereotype people sometimes. Have you ever done that? Everybody say yes.
Yes.
I knew you were going to say that. We stereotype people, but not everybody fits that stereotype. We're going to do a lot of bashing on the Pharisees before we get done walking with Jesus, and the Sadducees too. But not all the Pharisees were opposed to Jesus. We know Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, and later Saul, who will become the Apostle Paul. They were very devout Pharisees. So just because we want to put somebody in a classification does not mean all people fit that classification. They appear to have a hard time accepting Jesus as anything but a carpenter's son. Rather than investigate the evidence, they're stereotyping Jesus into something other than what he is. Now, on the one hand, they marvel at his words, but still they don't want to accept his claim. Have you ever been guilty of stereotyping somebody because of their race or their place or their position and being wrong in your assumption? And we've already talked about that. Now, Jesus reads their response. He sees the expression on their faces. This is kind of why I like having people in the class as opposed to just me in a room with a camera. Because I read your expressions and I can sometimes get some feedback on how well I'm teaching. Jesus sees there's an unasked question. This same skepticism hinders Jesus from doing very many miracles there. He cites two prophecies from the Old Testament who went to foreigners because the Jews rejected their ministry. Elijah helped a foreign widow when his own countrymen were also going hungry. And later Elisha cured Naaman, a Syrian, Israel's enemy, and he cures him of leprosy. That would be about like somebody in Israel going over to Iraq and healing somebody over there instead of healing his fellow Jews. That's kind of what Jesus did. And you know the Iraqis' attitude towards the Jewish people. Well, here's our picture. We have, a little different than the one you have in your book, but that's okay. The hill south of Nazareth where the people sought to throw Jesus. These young people are looking over it. It's a pretty good, it's steep enough you wouldn't want to get thrown down it. You'd toss and tumble and toss and tumble a ways. Now there's a valley between here and Nazareth. Nazareth is back behind us. The city of Nain is right over in here. Mount Tabor is off to the left a few miles. Off to the right is Mount Carmel and Haifa, and that area over there. And this is the valley where they say 200 million are going to get together and fight that battle, or whatever that battle, if that's a literal thing in Revelation. Come to our Wednesday night Revelation class. We'll talk about that then and there. Well, when you're feeling rejection, trust God to be in control. Glenn, you're talking to yourself right now, so pay attention. Luke chapter 4, verses 28 to 30. All people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, they drove him out of town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him down the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. Is that amazing, or is that just absolutely amazing? This wasn't any more pleasing to the Jews than Jesus' words were earlier in this account. They know that he's speaking against them, and they are enraged by their own guilt. It's beyond them that Jesus could be the Messiah. You know, there are some people today trying to silence Christians here in America because they are enraged by their own guilt, and they think that if they can silence Christians from telling them what they're doing is sin, and if they can get the government to condone and approve of what they're doing as sin, they won't have the guilt for the sin they're doing. Now, you and I have been around long enough, we know that that's not going to work. They tried to silence abortion. And the women that have had an abortion know that they have killed their baby. And so these other issues, all these other issues that the government's trying to legalize, is not going to free the individuals from the pain of their sin. Do you attend church to worship God, or because you like the preacher? Put yourselves in the shoes of a citizen at Nazareth. How many times have you wanted to ease your guilt by stopping the person who's reminding you of your wrongdoing? We confronted our granddaughter and a boyfriend many years ago because they were in church worshiping each other instead of Jesus and disturbing the people behind them a little bit. And when I said you're worshiping each other instead of God, they got rebellious. But when I defined worship, worship is ascribing worth to somebody or something. I worship Sylvia. I don't worship her as much as I worship Jesus. But I consider her somebody of worth. And I've got a few other things, people and things in my life that I consider worth. I ascribe worth to these things. But, you know, I would give everything, every bit of it up for Jesus if I had to. Jesus is more important. And I hope that in your life, that's your commitment also. Have you ever been wrong in an argument and had to apologize? Everybody say yes.
Yes.
Uh-huh. You don't want to admit it, but you've been there. We all know. We all have. And some of us have been okay and learned to apologize, and some of us just tried to pretend and wait till it went away. But we've been there. Because I'm not perfect, and neither am I. Well, our conclusion is this. Elijah and Elisha not only ministered to the Jews, but also to outsiders. And in similar fashion, Jesus offers salvation to the Gentiles, not just the Jews. Aren't you glad? I don't know if I've got any Jewish blood in me. If I do, it goes back way back, 200-300 years or so. I don't know. But I'm glad that Jesus opened up to the Gentiles. Our challenge is not to let rejection keep us from seeking and reaching out to non-Christians. Even though these people may reject you, those people might not. And you may not want to spend a whole lot of time around the people that are rejecting you, but look for the people that are open to the love, open to the message of God's salvation, and pursue them and see what you can do to build a relationship with them. We don't want to reject anyone else whom God has called. Who knows? You may be instrumental in bringing someone to Christ who will be the next Martin Luther, or John Wesley, or Billy Graham, or Bill Bright, or some other significant Christian leader. You don't know what God's going to do with your life yet. Well, next week Jesus is going to go fishing. I wonder what he's going to catch. Right now we're going to stop and have some discussion questions and see what happens there.